What's going on, guys? Welcome back to another amazing video from this awesome course. Hope you're enjoying it so far. In this one, to start things off, there's a couple things that I want us to fix. So first off, guys, I want us to go to the user service and talk about how we're using this async let functionality. And there are some issues that I noticed with the code that I want us to go over how to fix to get the desired effect. So if you guys remember us talking about this before, the whole reason we were using this async let notation here is to fire off these calls concurrently, right? So we don't want to have to wait to get the following snapshot back before we go and do this, before we go and do this. Ideally, we want all three of these processes or all three of these tasks to run simultaneously to ultimately end up returning this user stats object here. So this is actually typed out wrong. So even though we have the async let keyword, this is going to function synchronously because we are using this try await keyword or set of keywords every time we initiate a task. So anytime you have this await keyword, guys, it creates a suspension point and it doesn't continue the execution of the code until this process completes. So even though we're using async let, because we have this marked with await, it's going to create that suspension point. It's going to make sure that it fetches the following snapshot before it goes to this next await point. And then it's going to go and do this thing, and then it's going to go do this thing. So this is happening in a synchronous order. So what we can do is literally delete that try await there. And because this is async let, it is not going to require us to do that. So this is going to give us that desired functionality. And I realized another thing we could do, guys, is we could eliminate the need of having this property here, and we can just go add to the next line after documents and say .count. And then we can replace following snapshot with following count, and we could just delete this guy here. So this gives us the desired effect. And let's just go ahead and do this for the other two properties. So let's make that followers count, delete this, and then say .count at the end. Cool. And then same with our post snapshot. And we are going to delete this, say .count. And we're going to call this guy post count. And you guys are going to notice that we do get this error here. And if you click on that, it says expression is async, but not marked with await. So this is interesting, right? It says reading async let can throw, but is not marked with try. So basically, guys, what we have to do here is after this return statement, we need to say try await. So basically, we're trying to utilize all of these async let properties. And we have to have an await keyword in there somewhere because we have to ultimately await the result of all of those things. But basically, this is going to go and now execute all of these tasks simultaneously instead of synchronously. So this is going to be an asynchronous process. We're going to go and try to fetch all of these things, and we don't care the order that they come back in. It's just going to go and get them, and in whatever order they come back, we will ultimately return them when all of that stuff is done. But now we don't have to fetch this first and then go to this and then go to this. So this is a nice little performance improvement here, and it's the correct way of using async let. So let's just go ahead and run our code really quickly, guys. And then there's going to be one more issue that we are going to notice here that I want us to fix before we go over how to ultimately display the user's list of followers or following. So let's go to a user profile, and we notice that everything is still working as expected, right? So if I go to Venom, to posts, Black Panther, all zeros, all this stuff looks good, right? And if you guys remember from the last video, we introduced a bug fix to make sure we don't call that fetch user stats function twice. So there is a small problem with the new fix that we made, right? We sort of created a different problem, but it's actually going to be really easy for us to fix. So we go here, guys, we notice that we call fetch user stats. But I want you to pay attention to what happens if I go to my followers page and then I come back. It fetches the user stats again, even though I've already fetched them and this screen is already being held onto in memory because it just exists as part of a navigation stack, right? So I don't want to have to execute that call if I've already fetched the stats. So we can make it so that every time that I go to that user's profile, from there, we want to execute the fetch stats function. But if I'm going back to this page from another page, I don't want to execute that function call again. So basically, we just need to go back into this view model. And in this fetch user stats function, guys, we just need to add a guard statement. So we can just say guard user.stats equals nil, else return. And let's just go ahead and add a print statement in here. Print debug user stats already exists. And then we could just say user.stats. And then let's return. And then let's do the same thing for our isFollowed guy. So I want to say guard user.isFollowed equals nil, else return. And we don't have to add that print statement here. We sort of get the idea with what we're trying to do up here. I just want this message to show up to prove to us that we are hitting this guard statement and we are not executing this task. So let's go, yeah, I guess if we execute the task, we'll get this print statement back, so we're good to go there. So let's go ahead and run this and see what happens, guys. Let's see if that fixes our problem, and then we can get on into the fun stuff of this video. Not to say this stuff isn't fun. This stuff is super important, right? These are major performance improvements in our app, and we're making sure that we're building this stuff the right way because we're trying to be good programmers here, right? Good programmers make more money and build better apps. So we see that we're still fetching the user stats when we go to this page, which is good. But now if I go here and then I go back, you guys will notice that I don't have to execute that fetch again, right? Because they already exist. So the reason that's happening, guys, I mentioned this briefly before, is this page has been pushed onto our navigation stack, right? So when I go to this page, we're still holding on to all that stuff in memory because that screen still exists on the stack. So when I go back to it, everything has already been fetched for this user, right? Like the stats, whether or not we're following them. This page only gets destroyed when I go back from here, back to the Explore page, and then it gets tossed from our memory or our navigation stack, right? So now when I go back to it from here, it fetches a fresh batch of user stats. It gets us that most up-to-date information. So that's another nice performance improvement there. And we're just doing the same thing for the isFollowed guy. So those are just some nice little touches to add, guys. Definitely important for our app performance and optimization here. So I don't want you guys to ever gloss over that type of stuff, because if you do, you're going to end up building apps that suck. And that's not the goal here. We want to build good apps and be good programmers so we can make more money, right? So anyway, let's go ahead and move forward now, guys, with how to fetch this list of users that is relative to that particular component. So for example, if I click on this, I want to fetch followers. If I click on this, I want to fetch my following. Let's go ahead and get into that now. So let's go ahead and delete this first, guys. We don't need that print statement anymore. Let's clean our code up a bit. And let's talk about what we want to display here, right? So we ultimately want to display a list of users. Well, we pretty much already have that user list right here, right? And this has all of the functionality we need with like searching and displaying our list of users. So we pretty much just want to reuse this component. So we're going to do some view refactoring here, and we're going to reuse this component in that followers or following view, right? It's all going to be one big user list view, and we're just going to control the data that we fetch, right? We're just going to fetch a particular batch of users relative to the viewing mode that we're on. So for example, in the search viewing mode, we want to fetch all users, right? But if I go here and then I click on followers, I want to fetch a particular batch of users. So we're going to go over how to do that. But first we need to do some refactoring. So guys, in our components folder, let's go ahead and create a new file, SwiftUI view, and it's going to be called user list view. And let's go ahead and go to our search view, and we are going to grab all this code here, right? The scroll view and all that stuff, and we're going to paste it inside of this user list view. So that's great, right? So now we also need to do some work to get this view model here, right? So I believe if we go back to our search view, we have this search view model. And if we click into this guy, let's see, we have this function to fetch a bunch of users. So we can keep that search view model. I think what I want us to do is create a separate view model for this guy. So let's go ahead and make a new component here, and it's going to be a Swift file, and we're going to call this user list view model. And this view model is just going to be in charge of fetching a particular batch of users, right? So it's just going to use our user service and all that stuff to fetch the batch of users that we need. But we can pretty much just go and for now, guys, just copy and paste this search view model stuff in there because it's pretty much going to do the same thing. And then we'll go over how to modify both of them so we don't have copy and pasted code. Let's call this user list view model. And we need some users, and we are going to initialize this with a task of fetching all our users, and that looks good, right? And it's just using that user service. So let's go back to our user list view, and we're going to create a state object, var view model equals user list view model, right? And then, what do we want to do with this search text? Yeah, we're definitely going to want that search text as well. So let's see, at state private var search text equals a blank string. And that should solve all our errors. So what I want us to do really quickly, guys, is see if we can drop this component in our search view to sort of test out this refactor before we try to use it in other places. So let's go to our search view and let's delete this entire guy right here. And we are just going to say user list view. Perfect, right? And let's just go ahead and highlight this and hit Control I to indent all of our code. And let's run this bad boy, guys, and see if that's a successful refactor. Just want to make sure everything is still working as expected. So our build succeeds. That's looking good. And we go here and we can still see all of our users showing up. I can still click on them and everything is looking absolutely phenomenal. So now we can talk about how to reuse this component inside of our our views that are supposed to display our list of user relations. So let's go over how to do that now. So first off, guys, we're going to want to add an initialization parameter or some sort of dependency injection on our user list view. And if you guys remember, we created this user list config, and this is where this is going to come in, right? So this is how we're going to determine which batch of users we need to fetch. So once we initialize this user list view with that config, that's how we know what batch of users we'll need to fetch. So let's see if we can do that now. So we're going to say init with a config, which is our user list config, right? And then what we want to do, guys, is also initialize this user list view model with that config, because that's ultimately what we need to pass this config along to, because that's what's in charge of fetching our stuff. We could choose to do it that way, or we could just add a function on this view model that has an input parameter as the config. I'll show you guys how to do it with both ways, just so we have some options here. So you could either go here and say init with a config, which we'll do in a second, or you could just add a function that says func fetch users for config, something like this, right? With user list config. And right now we can just go ahead, cut this or paste that in there. And if you guys remember, we don't want to add any sort of complex tasks to our initialization method in a view model. So we're going to remove this and call this task from our as a view modifier here. So let's see, we need to say async throws, and that should solve that problem. We can make this entire thing a main actor class. We can now delete this function. That's going to throw some errors. Let's see where that throws. We can remove this guy and just have a blank initializer. Let's go ahead and add a print statement just to see how this thing is getting initialized, just to make sure everything looks okay with that. And let's see. Now we need to call this function on our user list view. So we go here, guys, and on our scroll view, we are going to add a task modifier. And we're going to say view model.fetch users for config. And here, guys, we need to make this config a class level property so that we can pass it along here. So we're going to say private let config, which is our user list config, and then we are going to say self.config equals config, right? So now this is a class level property, and we can use it along or in this task down here, and we're just going to say config. And then one more error we have to fix is passing a config here, and we'll say .explore. Okay, so this guy needs to throw. So let's go ahead and take a look at this function actually. So I think we could just, let's see. I think we could just make this async. And we could add a do catch. So I could say do catch. And we could just say try await user service.fetch all users. And catch, we could just say print debug failed to fetch users with error. Error.localized description. So now we can go back here and say await viewModel.fetch users for config. So that looks great, right? Guys, something with tasks is, for some reason, Swift made it so that you can't have a throwing function in this task guy. So you can't say try await in like a task modifier, right? You can only say await. Not sure why they did that way. I'm sure they have good reason for it, or maybe it's just functionality they're going to add later. But that's why we just made that modification there. So if we go back to this function, we removed the throws keyword and we just wrap this up in a do catch. So if something goes wrong, we do catch the error, but this makes it so now that we can actually use the task modifier to call this function because it's not a throwing function. It's just an asynchronous function. So once again, let's go ahead and run this bad boy and see if that works. Okay, so you guys notice that we get an error, and that's because we need to pass in a config. So this is where this comes in. So here, I want to use my explore config, right? So because this is the search view, I want to say use the explore config, and that is going to make sure that it fetches the correct batch of users. So I go here, and everything looks just great. So next up, guys, we need to write functions for fetching the other batches of users, right? So we need to be able to fetch followers, following, and maybe people that have liked a post and stuff like that. So let's go over how to do that next. So we are going to hop into our user service, guys, and we are going to write some functions here to fetch a particular batch of users based on the config that we are looking at. So let's go ahead and get started with what we need to do. So I want to create another static function here to fetch users for config user list config. And it's going to always async throws an array of users, right? And let's just say return some blank array to make sure we don't get any errors here. So basically we're going to want to do a switch through the config, right? And here we can see that we have access to all of the associated values for each one of our individual cases. And then explore is just blank, right? We don't need anything because we're just fetching all the users, and we actually already have that function. So what we can do here is just say return try await fetch all users, and we should be good to go there. Here we need to just delete these, and we need to figure out how to fetch these guys here. So right now, let's just say break, and break. And we're going to write the code to fetch this stuff now. So our errors should all go away. Okay, so yeah, we still actually need to keep that return statement there because we're not returning anything in these switch statements. So now, guys, let's go ahead and write some functions to figure this stuff out. So let's write a private static func, because these are going to be like private helper methods we use to fetch this stuff. So private static func fetch followers with a UID, which is a string. And we're going to say async throws an array of users. And we're going to just copy this function and say fetch following. And then we are going to say, what's one more we need? We need to fetch the users that liked a post. So what do we want to call that? Fetch post likes users. And then we are going to need a post ID here, right? And once again, just to get these errors to go away, let's just go ahead and return blank arrays. We're just trying to set up the foundation of this really quickly here. So all those errors should go away, and then we can call the corresponding functions in this switch statement here. So we're going to go here and say fetch followers, or return rather. Try await fetch followers with that UID. And then here, we're going to say return try await fetch followers or following with that UID. And then here, we're going to say return try await fetch post like users and pass in that post ID. Right? And now, because we are returning something in each one of our switch statements, we can just go ahead and delete that return statement. It will never get executed. All right, so we still haven't implemented the meat of these functions yet, but what I want us to do, guys, is just go ahead and call this function now inside of our user list view model to make sure this is working as expected. So here, we are going to say self.users equals tryawait user service dot fetch users for that config. So definitely a lot of moving parts, right? But this has all come together really nicely. So once again, guys, I'm just going to go ahead and run our code here just to make sure that my search page is still working, right? So we go here and guess what? We still have all of our users showing up there beautifully and our functionality is working as expected. So that looks great. And now we just need to go over what we got to do to fetch the users for that particular config, followers, following, and the likes. So basically, guys, we need to go and get the list of followers for this particular user and then go and fetch the users using each one of those user IDs. So I'm going to pull up Firebase just so we can actually run through the database and see what we have to do, because this is a two-step process, and then we're going to implement that. So our Firebase console is here, guys, and what we need to do is, for example, fetching our list of followers. Well, we have that list in this particular path in our database, right? We go to the followers collection, we find the current user ID, we go to their user followers, and then this will display a list of all of the people that they have as followers, right? So then we need to take each one of those IDs and then go into the users collection and fetch that user using that ID that we get back from that list, or all the IDs that we get back from that list. So like I said before, this is a two-step process. We're going to go and get a list of IDs and then use each one of those IDs to come to the source of truth, or the actual users collection in our database, to fetch the corresponding user information. Why do we do this way, guys? I mentioned that term single source of truth, right? Some databases will put all the user information or copy it in multiple places in the database, and that's fine. Because that could shrink this process down to a single step. Like you guys could imagine, if we had all the user data associated with this user ID duplicated in this place here, it would make our life a little bit easier. You're doubling up on data, and that's a drawback there. But another drawback is you lose that functionality of editing a profile. So if a user edits their username here or their profile image URL, you then have to go to each spot in the database where that user information exists and update the information there, which is highly annoying and almost impossible sometimes. So this users collection here with all of our user information serves as a single source of truth. So we always want to fetch our user information from here because it will always have the most up-to-date user information. That's sort of the reasoning behind that architecture and why we have to do things this way. So let's go ahead and figure this out. So in this function here, we just need to go to our followers path, go through that path. So we're going to say let snapshot equal try await Firebase constants dot followers collection, right? Dot document, and we need the current user ID. So we're going to say guardlet UID, or let's say current UID to be more specific. auth.auth.current user.uid, else return a blank array. And we need to go to the current user the current user's list of followers. And then we need to say dot collection user-followers. And then we need to say dot get documents. So that will give us back a list of data, right? Just a list of user IDs. And let's just go ahead and say return this empty array. And let's go ahead and copy and paste this for our following guy as well. We'll come back to the likes at a later point in the course, guys. So here we need to just say following collection, right? So we find that, let's see. Oh, we don't want this to be current UID. So let's figure out this path really quickly, guys. Yeah, it's actually this UID here, right? We want to just, whatever user we're looking at, that's the person that we want to go to in this list. So we actually don't need the current user ID here. That was my bad. So we use this UID. So basically, guys, just to do a recap on that, when we go to a particular user's profile and I click on following here, right? I'm on Iron Man's profile. So I want to fetch all of Iron Man's followers. So I go to my followers collection, I find Iron Man's ID, then I go to his user followers collection and get all the documents, right? So this is the only difference here is that we're going to the following collection and then going to that user's following list and doing the same thing. And let's just say return a blank array right here. So these two functions are giving us back the same things, right? They're giving us back some list of data. And those are all just going to be user identifiers. So we're going to write one more helper function to just fetch that user list with the particular, or fetch all the users with that list of IDs that we get back. So I'm going to write another helper function here, private func fetch users. And we're going to be looking at a snapshot, right? Which is a query snapshot, async throws, an array of users. And guys, we are going to say for doc in snapshot.documents. Then we are just going to say, we need to get a return array here. So we're going to create this return array, and we're ultimately going to return that here. And then for each document that we get back, we are going to fetch the user with that particular user ID, append it to this array, and then return that array. So we're going to say let user equal user. We are actually in the user service, so we can just say fetch user. Oh, do we not have a function to fetch a user with a UID? Yep, it's right here. Okay, so we should be able to call that. Try await fetch user with UID. Yep, there we go. Doc.document ID. And okay, so let's see. Oh, we need to make this static. That's why it wasn't working. And then we can actually just replace this with users.append. Just as a shorthand notation there. All right, so that looks good. Now, guys, we can call this helper method on these two functions, and that should wrap it up. So this is where this is all going to finally come together. So in this fetch followers guy, we can just say return fetch users with this snapshot, right? So we're going to say return try await. And then we're going to do the same thing here. So that's a super clean implementation. I know that was a lot, guys, and I am definitely going to go over that more once again in detail. We'll do a quick recap of this video because this is getting pretty long, and we've sort of shoved a lot of stuff into this video. But let's go ahead and see if this works now. The last piece of the puzzle is we just need to make sure that we show the user list view once we click on this guy right here. So we need to set up our navigation destination. So we go back to our profile, go to our profile header view, and instead of saying just go to a text, right, we're going to say user list view, and boom, we can just pass that config in, bro. And that's so smooth right there. So let's go ahead and run this bad boy. And I think that's going to work, guys. I'm so excited right now. Let's go. I don't know why I'm whispering. Okay, go to Iron Man followers and check that out. Let's go. And it's searchable, and all of that looks so good. Yay. All right, let's see. Venom, he doesn't have anybody. Doesn't have anybody. Following. That didn't work. Okay, so we're going wrong somewhere. But it's working for, let's see, Iron Man. Right? It's displaying Batman as his follower. So that's great. Okay, so this is looking pretty good. Let's just go ahead and see if we can figure out this bug. So user service. And we fetch following. Let's make sure we're following. Following, let UID, fetch following. Okay, so yep, fetch followers. Followers collection, following collection. Oh, duh, we messed this up right here. So we just need to make sure we change that collection name. And guys, this is a perfect example of where this stuff can go wrong. Ideally, we would need to introduce some more functionality here to like get this sub collection. We could write a function to do that. We'll probably do that in a future video as a cleanup. And it, once again, just removes the possibility for error there with spelling things wrong. And especially, it's really easy to mix something up like this with followers and following, right? But let's go ahead and run this again, and then we'll do a quick recap of everything we just did before we move on to the next video. Alrighty, moment of truth. Iron Man, followers, looking good. And let's go here, following, and it shows Iron Man. So that is looking amazing, guys. All right, so let's start from the beginning of how we implemented this and just run through it all really quickly before we end this video. Highly recommend sticking around for the recap. But anyway, guys, we started this off with a refactor, right? So we created this user list view. This thing has its own view model, and this view model is in charge of fetching or the users that this user list view is ultimately going to display, right? So we go to our user list view model, and this is awesome, dude. This is barely any code right here, right? And it just has a published variable for our users here, and we just pass in this config, right? We need to fetch the users for a particular configuration. That configuration could be our explore page, or it could be the followers for a particular user or the following of a particular user. And later on, what we're going to do is add the functionality to view likes for a particular post. So, and we just have to say try await user service and then access this function here, fetch users for that particular config. So the bulk of the work was done in the user service, right? So here we have all this code we just wrote for fetching users, right? So this is the function that the view model calls. We pass in the config, we do a switch through the config, and we call a particular function as like a helper method that's associated with fetching that particular batch of users. So we go down and drill into these helper functions. We have to go to a particular collection or a particular path where all of those users exist that we need to fetch, right? So for followers, we're going down this particular path and getting the list of documents back. So remember, guys, this returns a list of user IDs. Let's go ahead and add that in here. This gives us back a list of user IDs, right? So then we need to take that list of IDs, go through all of them, and fetch the users from the users collection using each one of those IDs. So that's where this fetch users guy comes in, right? So we have the snapshot of data that we need. So now we just go through this guy and we go through all the documents in that snapshot, right? Which is, in this case, each one will just represent a user ID. So let's make this a little more clear. Let's maybe say like let UID equal doc.document ID and then pass this in as a UID. Just makes that a little bit more clear as to what's going on. And then this is ultimately where we end up returning a list of users or an array of users. And that's where we call that helper function here. And we have a really clean, reusable code here. We're not copy and pasting a lot of stuff. And that's just a super smooth implementation, guys. And then ultimately in our profile header view, we say that, hey, when we click on a particular config, we want to go to that user list view and inject it with that config so the user list view knows which batch of users to fetch. So that's a super mega uber duper clean implementation right here. And in the next module, guys, we are going to be getting started with notifications. So this is going to be a ton of fun. It's going to add a lot of awesome features to our application that are going to increase things like user engagement and keeping them up to date with who's interacting with their content. So super important feature to have in any sort of social media or messaging application, something like that. And that's what we're going to be doing next. So get excited for that. We'll see you there. Peace.